Okay, we're going to get going. We're hoping that a few more people might wind their way to this rather out-of-the-way spot, but thank you to those of you who have managed to find us. I'm Alice Meadows from Orchid, and with Lauren Kane from BioOne, who's lurking at the back there and will be wielding the mic later. We are delighted to welcome you to this, well, I don't even want to call it a panel session because that makes it sound more formal than we hope it's going to be, but we have a fantastic array of speakers here who will introduce themselves a little bit more thoroughly, but just briefly, Peter Berkery from AU Press, American University Presses, Charlotte Rowe from the Library Publishing Coalition and the University of San Francisco, Jennifer Pessinelli of FASEB and President of SSP, still just. She's hanging on. Letty Conrad, who's a consultant and also the North American editor of Learned Publishing, and Juan Pablo Alperin from PKP and UBC, right?
Simon Fraser University.
Sorry, Simon Fraser. Oops. Wrong Vancouver University. Sorry. Okay, so we are here to talk about what we have been calling diversity and inclusion, but after yesterday's keynote, I'm thinking we should be calling social justice and equity. So apologies, that was a fabulous keynote, and I think we've all learned a lot already from that. I just want to set the scene a little bit before we go into the questions. So I pulled some quotes from recent Scholarly Kitchen posts, actually. So one of the things that SSP as an organisation is very much committed to, and the Scholarly Kitchen is increasingly trying to reflect, is this idea of engaging more broadly and deeply with diversity in all its forms, you know, whether that's gender diversity, racial diversity, ability versus disability, all those kinds of things. And so these, I'm not going to read them out, I thought this would be a nice place to start, recognising that we're making the first steps towards engaging more deeply, but we have a long, long way to go. And I hope that's why all of you are here to sort of help start or continue the conversation about this and how we can all get involved. I also really like, this is a kind of tough quote from the recent post of testimonies by people of colour who, you know, sadly but not surprisingly, didn't feel able to post with their names. They wanted to contribute anonymously, and when you read their stories, I think it was very clear why that was the case. And I think this is a particularly strong, it's quite a, you know, aggressive in some ways call to action, but I think this is really what's needed, and again, so I think this is a good framing for where we want to be in terms of talking about these issues. And are we up to it? I hope so, is the answer. I think, you know, hopefully the reason why we're in this room together is to start showing that we are up to it and start having those difficult conversations. So I'm going to move on to now the sort of, we've got a few questions that we want to ask of the panel specifically. We really want this, though, to be very much a sort of interactive discussion. We really want to hear from you, whether it's with questions or comments or suggestions about things that we should be thinking about or whatever. But we thought we'd start with some sort of questions, specific questions for the speakers to kind of set the scene again, and so that you can hear the different perspectives that they have and where they're coming from. This first question is also going to be a form of introduction to them, so they'll introduce themselves and their role and sort of why they're here, the position that they're here to reflect on the panel. So, Peter.
Sorry, I'm not
this
used to.
This session is
I'm
being
not
recorded.
Used to needing amplification.
It's been recorded, and we know now that Lauren and I went to a great session recently about the need for using mics if you want to be accessible, which is not something I think about it all the time because I have a very soft voice. Lauren, not so much, but but actually, please do use the mics. Everybody will have mics for the discussion as well.
Sure, absolutely. Is this just like who you are and where you're from, or is it all of question one?
This is all of question one,
please. Okay, great. So my name is Peter Berkery. I'm the executive director of the Association of University Presses. I've been in the role for 5 years. Before that, I was the vice president and publisher for the U.S. Law Division at Oxford University Press for 5 years. And then before I found the light, I spent 15 happy years toiling for various Dutch overlords in commercial publishing. I come to the question, I think the question is, what's your relationship to this topic, and in the notes that we received personally and professionally. And I'll confess, I found that aspect of the question just a little challenging on the personal side, because I don't often talk about that side. As a gay white man of a certain age in our society, I've managed to experience both the burdens of privilege and the joys of discrimination in my lifetime. But I don't tend in conversations about diversity and inclusion to focus on my own experience, because I haven't really decided how I feel about where it fits in. Professionally, diversity has been a key value for the Association of University Presses, at least since I started, and we formalized that in our, what was then new, strategic plan. There have been a number of, can I just ask how many folks who are in this session were in the pre-meeting session yesterday? I don't want to repeat things for people who've already heard it. So the association and the community have had several initiatives underway, with more to come. I think probably the most widely known initiative within AU Presses are the Mellon Diversity Fellowships that were created 2 years ago. Those place folks at 4 member presses, Georgia, MIT, Duke, and the PI on the Mellon grant that's funding these fellowships is with the University of Washington. Our second cohort is just finishing. The individuals spend a year working at a press in a specific department, but they get exposure to the functions across the operation. And the notion is that after a year of doing that, perhaps one of the barriers to increasing diversity within the community has been ameliorated through the necessary experience to gain employment at a university press. And the first cohort has come out and met largely with success. Interestingly, of the 4 individuals, 3 are still employed in the community, and 1 who did her fellowship, if she's a she, is it a fellowship? Who did her personship at in an editorial function, decided that she was really interested in production, and so now she's doing production work in Charlottesville at UVA Press. The second cohort's just coming out, and the third cohort's just going in, so we don't know where those folks are going to land. The grant will end with the end of the third cohort. We're hoping to engage Mellon in a conversation about expanding it, because there's broad interest among the association's member presses in expanding the program. There's at least a dozen other presses who would like to participate if they could. The fellows also receive free registration and travel to the association's annual meeting for the year their fellowship begins and the year that it ends. A couple of other initiatives. We also provide diversity grants directly to attendees at the annual meeting, and there's mentorship and fellowship opportunities for people of color who are at the annual meeting. We appointed a diversity and inclusion task force a year ago. Their report is finished. I haven't even seen it, but our board of directors will consider its recommendations at our upcoming meeting in June. So maybe on that one, stay tuned. And then finally, we've been, along with most of the folks at this table, I think we've been represented in the cross-organizational diversity task force that Melanie has been spearheading. So that's us.
Thank you. Charlotte?
Yeah. I'm a little shorter. Hi. So I'm the scholarly communications librarian at the University of San Francisco, which is a small Jesuit university with a social justice mission. So it's really easy for me to talk about the intersection of scholarly publishing and social justice. Like at my university, when I say academic institutions are historically colonialist institutions, everyone's like, oh yeah. Like faculty, staff, students, everybody, right? So that makes it really easy for me to talk about scholarly publishing and do workshops and talk about like how they might be biased and stacked and how to navigate those ecosystems. So that's what I do in my professional life. Also, I am going into my second year as the Library Publishing Coalition's inaugural co-fellow, along with Reggie Reju from the University of Cape Town. I think he's on the diversity committee here, but I'm not entirely sure of that. The project I've been working on the past year with the Library Publishing Coalition is the Ethical Framework Task Force, right? Which is just now open for comment, I think, to members in its first draft. It includes sections for accessibility, diversity, equity, inclusion, privacy and analytics, academic and intellectual freedom, and publishing practice. So it's not intended to replace the guidelines from the Committee on Publication Ethics, and in fact, it builds on the work not only of COPE, but other accessibility guidelines and diversity, et cetera, all the things I mentioned. It's more of a resource document, really. And the reason that it was created was a response to the political climate, as well as a book chapter that I wrote with Harrison Inafuku of Iowa State University called Agents of Diversity and Social Justice, Librarians and Scholarly Communication with Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. So personally, that's professionally, so my background is in academic publishing. I worked at Taylor & Francis and Oxford University Press in editorial, and then I changed careers and I moved to librarianship, where now I continue to do library publishing, journals, repository, preprints, all that kind of thing.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Are we on now? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'm Jennifer Pessinelli. I'm Deputy Executive Director for Operations at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, FASEB. It's a federation of 30 scientific societies, and we're based out of DC. And I have been there for a very long time, but came up through their publications program before I took on a lot of other responsibilities. And it was in my role in publishing there that I got involved with SSP. I am the current president. You've probably seen me a few times over the last 2 days. So it's from that perspective that I am on this panel and want to talk about what SSP has been doing. And so one of SSP's goals, as I did mention at the lunch today, is to demonstrate leadership in the effort to expand the diversity of professionals working in scholarly communication and foster a culture of inclusion through awareness, outreach, and striving for diverse representation across all programs. In this past year, as I mentioned, we have implemented a diversity and inclusion task force, and they are focusing on educating our members on building diverse and inclusive communities through publication of articles, webinars, workshops, and annual meeting sessions. Also supporting diversity and inclusion in scholarly publishing by conducting outreach to traditional and non-traditional students and postdocs at institutions with diverse populations. And finally, in improving our ability to support diversity and inclusion initiatives within the organization by providing training and resources for our members and modeling inclusive practices within SSP. And as Peter mentioned, that we also initiated a cross-organizational initiative this past year, spearheaded by Melanie Dolachek, our executive director, who's with us in the room this afternoon. This initiative represents a number of industry associations that have come together to discuss, study, and address the topic of diversity and inclusion in scholarly communication. Activities include developing a joint statement of principles, conducting market research, providing training resources, best practices, toolkits, and documentation for all of our collective membership, and establishing outreach programs, curriculums, events, and publications. And we're really just getting started. The initiative has been formally named now. It's Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications. There are 11 organizations that are participating in this effort: SSP, CSE, ALPS, ISTME, STM, OASPA, AUP, UKSG, NASIG, LPC, and ACRS. I think I got that list right. So, you know, certainly we really want to work not only from the individual perspective of our organization, but also the industry as a whole. And so I've been participating in that this past year and look forward to continuing to do that as well. And I wonder, as Alice mentioned in the introduction and after our keynote yesterday, you know, do we start with new terminology as well? And actually that whole keynote yesterday I thought was fantastic, and I have a lot of questions now. So, and that's part of the reason too that I'm looking forward to the rest of this panel and the discussion with everyone in the room as to where we go and what we do.
Thank you, and I think we definitely want to come back to the language issue. It would be really good to have some people's feedback on that. So, Letty.
Thank you. So gosh, the personal aspects I didn't really unpack prior to this. I think we all have various experiences. Certainly being a young woman in digital product management and rooms full of white men certainly have personal experiences, but the thing that I'm hoping to share and really draw on today is my role and my responsibility as North American editor for Learned Publishing Journal. The editor-in-chief, Pippa Smart, and I regularly work with our reviewers and actually gut check each other occasionally for biases, and are we being as fair as we can be? Are we being as inclusive? How are we recruiting? Really paying attention to how we're building the voices and perspectives that are represented in the journal. But one of the first things that I got to do in this role is work on the issue that was published in January of this year, which focused on accessibility. And this is a topic of equity and inclusivity that has been a very key one for me in my career, especially in digital product development, wanting to be sure that we are not overlooking and making assumptions. We are not the average user, whoever we may be, and that we check those biases as we're working through our everyday jobs. So this special issue was really meant to contribute to the work that all of us do every day in thinking about dissemination of knowledge and scholarly resources, that we're thinking about the disabled reader experience, that we're aware of the various limitations in cognitive or physical capabilities that may limit readers' ability to interact with the material and the resources that we publish. So this special issue pulled on a range of perspectives. We have some first-person pieces from a blind man and his experience through college, and eventually establishing a accessible publishing company, and all of the technological and sort of digital innovations that have cropped up over the last 5 to 10 years that are opening up new avenues for us all to engage in accessible publishing in a more scalable way that fits into digital workflows, from concept development through to dissemination. Being able to ensure that, for instance, it's not just the consuming of the material, but also that we're paying attention to the disabled author experience. What do we need to do with peer review systems, submission processes, et cetera? So I encourage you all to take a look at that issue. I think that disabled experience is one area of inclusivity that we often just kind of go, race, gender, age, but there are other areas of experience that I think are important to wrap into that. So that's one of the things that I want to represent today.
Thank you. And Juan?
Hello, so I'm Juan Pablo Alpern. I sort of have 3 different hats that I'm wearing all the time these days. One is just an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in a publishing studies program, and so I work and I'm embedded in a structure as an academic and as a researcher. But for 10 years, I've been working with the Public Knowledge Project, so a university-led initiative, for those that are not aware, that amongst the many things that we do, including research, one of the main things that we're known for is for building open source platforms for managing and publishing academic journals. And I'm also as my role as an academic, the director of the Scholarly Communications Lab, which is a research group doing different research around issues of scholarly communications, in particular with a focus on the public's use of research. And so, so I bring all of those sort of, I play on both sides of the fence around both on being the researcher who is the subject and the object of many of the discussions that happen at this conference, but also being a platform builder and working on the side of producing the tools and the things that bring that are then used by academics. But in terms of the relationship to the topic of diversity, the main thing that has brought me, so my background is I'm originally from Argentina, but my family immigrated to Canada. So my definition of my sort of personal identity has been defined for a long time, having been someone that has lived both half my life in Latin America and half my life in various parts of the world, in Canada and the US. I am constantly being defined by the otherness. No matter where I am always the other thing. Whenever I'm in Canada, I'm the Argentinian, and whenever I'm in Argentina, I'm the Canadian, because I am simultaneously both and simultaneously neither. And I've been working when I moved back to Argentina in 2007, because I wanted to go and live there as an adult, having immigrated to Canada as an 11-year-old. I started working, it was at the same time that I got in touch with PKP and I started working with PKP around running workshops for journal editors in Latin America around the use of the OJS platform. And it was at that time that I became sort of very deeply aware of what it means to try to be producing knowledge from the so-called periphery, from a region of the world that has a very strong identity as a region, but who, even though there is a critical mass of the number of countries in Latin America that speak a common language, that have a shared history, and that have a way of thinking and a way of knowing, but that are subjected to participating in a system of scholarly production that is not their own. And so when I come to as I've been working in this space now for 10 years, and I come to I go participate in meetings around scholarly communications, which predominantly the discussions about scholarly communications in where people who are actually building the systems, the infrastructure, and creating the rules of play, the metrics that are being used to define them, when I would see what it's like to be working participating in these meetings where these discussions are happening, where none of the people from the regions of the world where I have spent a lot of time in are actually present and participating. And so I always try, and this is what I've taken on as my personal role as being someone that now works in a Canadian institution, but that continues to have an interest in and that continues to work for and understanding Latin American scholarly communication. I've taken it on as my mission to try to play this role of articulating both perspectives and acting as this bridge, using this duality in my own personal identity and my own history and experience to be able to play the role of, when I'm in Latin America, to try to say, okay, this is how they're defining the rules of play, and so what do we want to take of what is being done and appropriate in Latin America, and then how can I bring those perspectives of the needs and requirements and the perspectives of Latin American scholars to these discussions so that we bring those things forward. In my role as PKP, this is why PKP has become, why I've been continued to work with them for 10 years, why it's such an important part of my professional identity. PKP is deeply ingrained, is because I feel like PKP is one of the few organizations that is trying to build tools that is taking into account perspectives of scholars from other parts of the world. It's very rare to see people building tools that are multilingual, for example, right from the get-go, that have community participation in defining what are the characteristics of those tools and what it is that needs to be done. Tools that are intended to be used and installed locally and to be used to allow people to appropriate those tools and take them and do with them what they will. And so with PKP, the software that we do has been designed from the get-go to be able to be used and adapted and adopted locally and be used in whatever ways the communities that take them up wish. And they're not tools that are sort of imposed or brought on with one set of rules that everyone working needs to adapt. And so I bring those, which probably still I'll get into a little bit more of that when we talk about what are the things that our organizations are doing. But that perspective, for me, PKP, it sort of embodies the type of organization that, although it's working from the global north, is really trying to make sure that those who are able to participate in global production don't run into or have the same tools and capacities to be able to do it as everyone else.
Thank you all. So we're going to go into the sort of more general questions, and this is where we're hoping you're going to start getting involved as well. So, and we're also probably going to switch it up a little bit in terms of the order of who speaks when. So the first sort of big question that we posed our speakers is, in 10 years' time, so when SSP celebrates its 50th anniversary, what progress do you hope to see? What does, I'm going to call it now, equitability and social justice look like in terms of our companies, of SSP and other membership organisations, and the broader scholarly community? So I'm going to start with a few comments from you, but we would, again, love to hear from you in the audience as well. So if you have a suggestion or a contribution to make, please just pop your hand up and we'll let the panel say a couple of words first, and then we'll move to your comments. So who would like to...
So I have just a couple of brief comments on here to share. So what does progress look like? And I say that we have identified biases, structures, and culture which exist that perpetuate the status quo, and that we have made progress in eradicating and or at least improving them through education and a long-term commitment. So to me, that would be some much welcome progress, and that we are developing relationships based on mutual respect and accountability. And I think all of that would go a very long way to making some significant and positive changes in this space. So that's a brief.
Yeah, I can add to that. I'm just gonna. I'm like, just keep it simple. So gosh, yeah, one of the things, really practical things that comes to mind is something that I talk to publishers quite a bit about lately, which is making alt text for images and tables and graphs a standard part of your production workflow. It sounds really boring and technical, but we're talking about putting meaning and text behind the images that, for those who may be using screen reader software, those with sighted issues, various disabilities, they're looking for help to understand what that flat image file is. And it's one of the things that I actually find a real challenge with publishers, is convincing them that this is a good idea. Getting it into the production workflow for all new content going forward, that's a win. But going back and remediating the material in the back file, especially that material that has been regularly cited, that readers are regularly chasing up, wanting to know more about material that is popular. They're unable to really interact with the tables and the images that are in that material. So making that a budget priority, seeing accessibility sort of swim lanes, if you will, on every product roadmap, having that be a funded issue for every publisher, I would say that would be a real win 10 years from now. Another area of passion for me in digital product development is content discoverability, searchability, indexing, and certainly Dr. Noble, it will be on my shoulder every time I consult to discuss search engine optimization, semantic meaning making, AI, and using some machine learning to enhance our ability to interact with content. I would like to hear more questions about what bias is inherent in that data. I think that would be a real sign of progress for sure.
I mean, for me, just continuing on the theme, it's that this is a global enterprise around global participation, but that doesn't mean that it's the same system that needs to, even though, we try to think, often we talk about science in these sort of global terms about how it's some universal science, that having results be, the laws of physics might be applicable and might be the same everywhere in the world, but that doesn't mean that the problems that need to be investigated or the way that those problems are tackled are relevant or are pertinent in every part of the world. And so for me, having organizations that have membership, regardless of whether they are, where they're based, if you're going to be working in the areas of scholarly communication, then that means that the people that need to be present and need to have an active voice and an opportunity to shape the conversations need to be a representative of the global community that's working and doing scholarship, and that means that there needs to be people at the table from different regions of the world, and that people need to work to build the tools and services that address their needs, and that involves not just having them present, but engaging with them and having them participate in the discussions around what it is that they're trying to do. Often because scholarly publishing in North America is a business the way that it isn't in other parts of the world, that means that often here the incentives and the drive for things is that those are markets that have those other parts of the world are seen as markets that haven't been tapped yet. And so I think I would love to see that the inclusion of other parts of the world is not necessarily engaging them on a commercial basis as potential customers, but rather as a community that needs to be listened to and attended.
So while I was ruminating on this question on my flight out yesterday morning, and it was an early flight and I didn't stop at Starbucks, so bear with me, it's all going on in my head. it occurred to me, kind of out of nowhere, but kind of because I've thought the question before. It's like, okay, there's 200 people on this plane, and yet it just doesn't look like America. Why is that? What's behind how that came to be? And I'll interrupt myself and say that I think that, at least I find it, that's a useful frame, I think, for people who have been on the receiving end of privilege, which is, largely white people, especially white males, to think about things, which is, why doesn't whatever it is look like the larger culture that it's participating in? And so I think for me, 10 years from now is what does success look like? Is an organization that reflects the diversity of the country we live in, products that reflect that diversity, services, how we add value to how we bring value and add value to our organizations and our common enterprises reflects that same larger diversity. Because, the term's an oxymoron, right? But we're 30 years away, not even, we're 25 years away from being a majority-minority country. It's an awful, awful term. And if we had some millennials in the room, they'd probably tell me what the right word is. But the truth is, we have a very short window to get this right. And I think it is going to be probably the defining issue of whether or not we succeed or fail as a culture.
I'm so happy with this panel for being so thoughtful. They basically said everything I was going to say. So there's that. But to sort of riff off of what Peter just said, one of the things I like to do in academia is to ask white people in the room to look around and count the number of white people they see. Try it right now. And that flips the equation, because when we look around the room, we have a habit of seeing the people of color and saying, oh, there's diversity in here, right? But I don't think white people understand how hostile that looks to people of color who walk into a room, in any academic room, right? Any academic room. It doesn't matter if it's SSP or anywhere else. So I'll ask us as an organization to start doing that and start understanding what it looks like.
Thank you. So this is the point at which we're going to start opening it up. You don't have to contribute, but we would really love to start hearing from you. So does anybody have any comments, any questions for the speakers at this stage?
I have an Alice kind of voice, so I needed that microphone. Well, one aspect that wasn't discussed, and I think about a lot when I'm listening to discussions such as this, is I fear that things won't get much better until our infrastructure supports, in the case of women, childcare at reasonable costs. The demographics, the challenges that for any woman to get back, to stay in the workforce, to make it work, are horrific. But then you add in layers of economic background, impoverished backgrounds, it just doesn't work. And so people can't even get into the organizations and rise through. And unfortunately, we're without, I know we don't want to get into a big political discussion, that just doesn't look like it's getting better right now. But I think that's a really critical piece.
Yeah, we haven't said too much about the gender issue actually so far, which is fine actually, but it is another issue. I think it's a different type of issue, because the gender issue, women are very well represented, certainly white women in our industry, not so much women of colour, but white women are very well represented, but we don't on the whole reach the top of our organisations.
I think there's challenges for women of colour
absolutely.
I come from Detroit,
absolutely.
That kind of says it all.
But there's also, I think, socioeconomic diversity is another issue that we haven't really touched on, and I think that's another big issue. Yeah,
it's wrapped up in it at certain levels.
So I don't know if any of you would like to respond to either of those points.
I would just add, I think both Sue and Juan have hit on something that kind of comes back to one of my passions, which is qualitative research to really understand a contextualized experience of someone. And in my world, it's an information user, right? But taking a step back, it's any human. And it's really rising above your own worldview to say, what is your experience? And actually care, right? Not just because I need to and I need to check a box, but because I want to understand how the researcher workflow is different in a different country. I've not been to, you know, a country that I'm not familiar with. That kind of exposure, it's uncomfortable. You know, it's challenging what my worldview, but I think that's part of whether it's economic or gender, you know, or region or ability is just slowing down enough to understand what is that contextualized experience of that individual.
Was your name Sue? Sue. I completely agree with you. Like, the systemic injustices of society seem like really difficult to counter, right? I'm gonna say that how many of you saw the UK reports of the gender pay gap in publishing? Yes. Horrible, right? Like, and also, like, when I was working at Oxford, they instituted paternity leave, and one of my colleagues looked closely and found that they had instituted paternity leave, which is amazing, but then, like, decreased maternity leave, like, as like a response, as if they were even somehow. Yeah. So yeah, we're definitely complicit. I know, and then we like revolted because of course it was majority women in the institution, and then they reversed it. So yeah, and I will. I know it sounds horrible, but it was fixed. So like, I will say, if we're not explicit about changing it, then we're just complicit in continuing it, right? Yeah.
I would just add on the gender pay gap issue that I think the really powerful thing about that, to Sue's point, is at last we have some actual data. It may not be completely comprehensive, perfect data, but there is data, and that means that we can have the information we need to know whether we're making any progress.
And isn't there a session on that particular topic scheduled for tomorrow?
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we had another question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cece, and I want to congratulate SSB on having a diversity and inclusion, task force, and thinking of various initiatives that would really benefit a whole bunch of people at early on, not coming into jobs and experiencing and be prepared and be sort of all inclusive when they're in the workforce. I guess my question is, I know SSB is thinking about providing training and resources to the institutes, conducting webinars and stuff like that. But is there a sustainable long-term program to gauge the engagement, to follow up? Are there some matrices you have thought about, some sort of a response that tells you, are there going to be some checks in place to follow up on the progress and build up on it, and essentially maybe try to come up with new approaches to fill the gaps that might still exist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great point. So we don't have those things yet, but certainly we want them to be meaningful, impactful, and long-term. So absolutely, we will need to put in place mechanisms to evaluate our efforts, what we're doing, and find out if if they are working, what changes we need to make, and what kind of long-term impacts that we're having. So, thank you for raising that. Absolutely, that's something that we need to do as part of this initiative.
Melanie, do you want to add anything to that, or is...
Melanie will tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're definitely not wrong. I think one of the big things that we're doing in the first step with the coalition is to get some quantitative measurement. I think the qualitative stuff is great. We have a lot of that. It's really raised awareness of this issue, and it made us look around, which is the first step. But the coalition is going to be commissioning a survey to go into organizations, much like the gender pay gap data, but going into organizations, asking them for data about their workforce on lots of different demographic areas. We need to know where we're at from a very quantitative standpoint. And not that the qualitative data isn't important, but that will then serve as the baseline. And we want to know what we're doing. Are webinars effective? Or is training effective? Is internships program, internships outreach? All of these things that we're talking about doing, We want to know if they make a difference, and we want to be able for those organizations that participate to know whether they're making a difference, whether participating in these activities have shifted things at all. So I think that that's kind of the first step in this process. And as we get that data and we start to see if we're impacting change, then I think our strategy will change. So if webinars and things like that are not, and that training and outreach are not very effective, we'll change course. I mean, I think that's the beauty of being able to be flexible about how we're doing it. But the first thing is, where are we right now? I mean, we know there's an issue, but we want to quantify that so we can see where we're at, where we're going.
And I think there was maybe another. Okay.
Hi. Okay, better. So it's maybe not necessarily a question, but sitting here looking at this question, and I'm a very solutions-based oriented person. So just thinking, in 10 years, we'd like to look out at the sea of faces and see just more of a mixture, I think, is what we're looking to see people, and not just physically. We want people who have come from different places, speak other languages, and I think part of what makes it challenging to get to that place where you feel like as many different perspectives are represented as possible is that those who have been excluded, if you just one day say, oh, now we are inclusive, they've already been excluded. You have to invite, you have to entice and find and really put in extra effort to have people who have been previously excluded from this to come and join. So, I think partnering with organizations like the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, which I owe a lot to, that works to have underrepresented people pursue PhD studies and get into academia, partnering with organizations like that, because it's a really great pool of the kinds of really brilliant, smart people who have traditionally been excluded are now being included, are including themselves and are willing to sort of step in and step up. I think that would be a good way for the SSP to, in 10 years, have a better sort of mixture. I think, things like we at Wiley, I say to my society boards all the time, we give away as many subscriptions as we sell. But when I look at the authors, the geographic breakdown of the authors, I am like so happy to see one paper from Nigeria. I'm like, who is that? Let's send them a thank you. So or seeing like Africa grayed out on the map of where people are buying your subscriptions. It's just grayed out, or where our target markets. I mean, you've seen this before. They may not have the infrastructure for good internet quality to have, oh great, we've got all these, we're giving you these digital subscriptions. Well, they don't have internet, so how is that helping? Are we really helping them to, they can't afford ScholarOne. Are we really going to support research output, not just disseminating and throwing our information at people in places that we like to consider emerging, but not really giving them the tools to participate back. We're not actually increasing the output from those places. It's very nice of us to give them this information. Yes, we love, especially in the West, we love to sort of play that role, and here you go, we were gifting you with knowledge. We are not taking that knowledge back the other way. And so I think really thinking about how we get to those places and really what are the challenges? How can we invest in some way in increasing the output there and inviting them, bringing them to the meeting, making sure, seeking them out, recruiting them, headhunting them to come and be on the board or be at the meeting or be on the panel or host a session, people that would never even consider or don't even know, and really going and finding those people that are doing the good work in these places and making the extra effort to contact them in a meaningful way and invite them. I think that invitation part really has to happen, and that is something that is hard to do because you think, well, we've said we're inclusive. Everybody's so nice. This is the society of special people. Everybody here is amazing, but it doesn't mean that people are going to automatically think that they're welcome. And so I think being inviting is one place to start.
And I think not just being invited to join, but being invited to have a seat at the table is a really important part of that as well. And I think that's, for me, that's something we could definitely, I would love to see us having done that in 10 years' time.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you added the bit about the exchange being bi-directional, because while I agree that extra seats at the table are necessary, they're not sufficient, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that the table was designed and built by white people. White culture decided how many people get to sit at the table. It's not just a matter, this isn't noblesse oblige, and it's not tokenism. We got to buy new furniture.
Or go and use their furniture, right? Because it's not just, because that's the question, right? It becomes about not, it isn't bringing, they don't have to come, it's also about going to, go to the other places, go find other places, and I mean not in the physical sense, and also, but also just find out what it is that those other communities are interested in or are looking to do, and then making an effort to go and learn about those things. So figure out, okay, what is it that we can do to support you in your work, not what is it that you can bring to add to what we're already trying to construct and do.
But that's not the analogy I was trying to make, and I don't want to burden it to the point where it breaks. But I think that ultimately, the table that we all sit at has to be a common table. It can't be our table, can't be your table. Yes, the people at my table need to spend a lot more time sitting at other tables, but ultimately we all have to build a table together.
And I would just like to add, actually, that I do think the geographical issue is a tough one, because I think we do need to be more willing and able to go out in the world rather than expect people to come to us and learn from us and for it to be that one-directional thing. But it's really challenging. I mean, when we think about where we're going to have our meetings at ORCID, which is very much a global organisation, very committed to, working with people and organisations from every part of the world, it's really challenging to try and organise meetings or events in, places like Africa or Latin America. So I think it would be great to make some progress on some of that logistical stuff, and and sort of break down those barriers. I think would help a lot as well. So Liz, you. Lawrence. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hold the thought.
Hi, my name is Liz Lervier, and I work in academia. I'm a librarian, and I really, this topic really touches home. I live in Michigan as well, but I live in Southwest Michigan, where we're 89% white. That's our county. And so it's really hard to recruit to that area. We work really hard. But some things that are on my mind that our community is doing in Kalamazoo, because we want to be diverse and equitable, is that we have a pipeline program. We're starting with high schools in the region, because this solution is not going to be fixed. I mean, I hope it'll be fixed in 10 years, but for our area of Michigan, we're starting with pipeline programs, and we're starting with 8th graders and high school students to get them interested in the health sciences. And my part of it is also showing them medical librarianship, but I'm also talking about scholarship and research, and I'm adding a little bit of publishing to that, because I've been a member for SSP for many years, and also library associations. I am a demographic. I'm a 45-year-old white female. And so, I encourage you all, if you can, to go back to your local community, even if it is diverse, and look at pipeline programs. Ask your local colleges or universities what they're doing. I'm very frustrated with the schools of library and information science. Every year when I ask them, I'm going to hire somebody, I'd like to see all your candidates. I'm looking to diversify my staff. They have never produced me a person of color, and I've only had women apply. So I leave my positions open much, much longer, usually 8 months, to find a very diverse staff. And that's very hard on me. It's very hard for me to justify to my dean and the board of trustees like what I'm up to. But they understand the bigger picture because we're trying to diversify. At my university, we actually have left positions open for 2 years to try to diversify because we are trying to do better. So my take-home message to all of you is, like, when you go to these types of talks, usually like you leave and you're like, oh, I feel good, But you have to actually do something. And you can do something locally with either your high schools or your community programs, your colleges and universities. You can say you're a working professional, you're looking to do internships, pipelines. I've gotten grants for our pipeline program. Do a talk, something, because that's where you have to do. You have to start to plant the seed, and you have to continually plant that seed, and also make those relationships with those students and their parents. It's very difficult for those parents to take off work and get their kids to a pipeline program. We actually got grants to pay the parents not to work to take their kids to the pipeline program. And so it's really important that you have those relationships and you foster them, and you continue through like either community college or college. You offer them maybe internships, paid or unpaid, because that's how we're going to fix this problem. I believe that's one of the ways we're going to fix this problem. Yeah. Anyways, thank you very much for listening to me.
And I'd like to respond to that. I mean, I think that definitely goes for scholarly publishing, because we like to talk, at least I like to talk about scholarly publishing as the accidental profession, because no one ever says, you know, when they pick a major, I want to be a scholar in scholarly publishing. Like, nobody even knows what that is. So at least people know what librarians are and generally what they do. So I think that really is even more important for scholarly communications as a whole, because people don't know what it is. And you're right, it's a long-term, you know, thing as well. So and I really like your suggestions of, you know, how to make an impact personally. And I kind of disagree with our keynote speaker who said, you know, it's not about the individuals, changing individuals' minds and behaviors, because individuals make up organizations who make up political, you know, decisions and so forth. So it has to start at some level, and it's easier to start at the bottom and work our way up, because people make up the basis of everything that we do. So.
Does anybody want to respond?
I wanted to ask if SSP or anyone in the industry of publishing has looked at other industries as a model or an example of a success, another industry that has diversified. I worked in IT for a decade, and there's a constant talk in IT of trying to bring in more women and bring in people of color, and to a certain degree they have succeeded in increasing it, but there's also a definite career path into that industry, and I think that's difficult for publishing because there's not one entry point or one way to get here. So I just wondered if you know of another industry that has been successful, and are there things that we can learn from another group?
I actually would have said education if Liz hadn't just given us a really great example. I was raised by educators, and so in California, where I live and work, there's quite a bit of both individual private institution mandates as well as state level mandates, and that certainly helps. But it's also brought in systems and programs and taught people how, whether, hidden bias training or, tools for recruiting and fostering, workforce in different ways. I would point to education as being an area of success for sure.
Hey, so where we want to be in 10 years' time, this was a sort of discussion at the board chair's dinner one night, and part of that was really more diversity, people of color, some way we can get more people other than all white people on the board or eventually as a president. Now, I think we have to set up people to succeed too, because there's a lot of work goes to get people even to that level, and so there's some talk with a few people, meet Barbara Myers and a few, about identifying people who could make that path and sort of mentor and help them along the way. I think we've got some great groups and things happening with fellowships and bringing in people from around the world from the mentoring programs. So I don't know if the committee's talked about those types of things, of identifying tracks and ways that you can set them up to succeed sort of going forward. And the sort of flip side of that, though, is I think there's also a lot of, just to be mindful, there's also a lot of people who put a lot of hard work in who are also equally qualified, that you don't want to do it too much to one side, that then they feel put out as well. So it's finding that right balance and how you find those tracks to develop people in there, which I think is a challenge we all face. But.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I think we probably have time for one more question, and then I'm going to prep you guys a bit, going to give you the opportunity to give a one-word or one-sentence answer to our last question, which is, what are the biggest obstacles? You have 2 minutes to prepare.
So my comment was about the nature of the accidental profession. So I think that if your organization has finder's fees or encourages people to share jobs with their friends, that can be super, super problematic because people tend to cluster with people who look like them and act like them. So one thing that we've had success with at Duke University Press is working with our local HBCU, and we partner with the communications department there, and we have students come in for informational interviews, and then when an internship comes up, that person's now in our network. So we're able to just have people that we already know who are not like us, and yeah. So anyway, if you have received a finder's fee, I'm sorry to advise you to give it up, but that's one piece of advice.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask each of you, what one thing, fairly quickly, do you think is the biggest obstacle to making progress?
I'll start by saying that to have a more, a global participation in knowledge production that is truly global, are really challenging the structures and the business models that are in place for scholarly publishing in North America. And so being willing to challenge and restructure the way that scholarly publishing is done to allow for global knowledge production will be disruptive. And if we want that, then we need to be willing to put up with that disruption.
I prepared all kinds of thoughts, but I'm going to scrap everything I just said and say that I think one of the biggest obstacles is just us being human, and we are all every day fighting a very primitive fear of things that are different from us. And I love Melanie's thoughts as well as Dr. Noble's. I think it's a matter of individual responsibility, gut checking those assumptions every day. None of us are blameless, but blame is not useful. So I would say it's just a matter of awareness every day, bringing greater awareness to your decisions.
And so I would take both perspectives, because I think institutional structure is definitely a huge obstacle to this, and the bigger, more challenging thing to overhaul. But the fact that I do think we can, as individuals, make an impact, and it has to start somewhere. So I'm top down and bottom up, anything we can do.
This is one of those things where the panel keeps saying the same thing, the panelists. I was like, yes, institutional change, right? I know, it's good. Institutional change. I think that, so speaking as a very privileged Asian American, heteronormative, able-bodied woman with a master's degree, right? Like, it has been difficult for me to realize and grapple with the fact that I need remedial education. Like, my childhood education and history has taught to me was completely whitewashed, right? And that's the case for all of us, because I'm really well educated. All of us need completely remedial education on a personal level in order to tackle institutional change.
So this might be a variation on that. I think really I would kind of reiterate what I said yesterday that I thought the biggest obstacle was, which is we need to have some uncomfortable conversations, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and they're conversations that are particularly uncomfortable for the people who look like the folks who created the power structure that's in place right now. There's a few of my people have come out of the woodwork in the past few years who would reject the notion that conversation is necessary. But the majority of us are somewhere else in the spectrum, and we don't know how to do that. And there are no rules of engagement for how we might do. There's no framework for us to have these uncomfortable conversations. And I think probably creating that space, creating that framework, would facilitate the kind of dialogue that's going to get us to the other side of this bit of the challenge.
Thank you all for very thoughtful contributions, and the audience too. Just before we end, I want to ask all of you a question, which is, I know SSP is very committed to effecting change over the next 10 years, but having listened to the speakers, heard the comments from your own personal experience, put your hands up if you're hopeful that we will see real change in the next 10 years. Well, that's good, thank you, because I think the only way we can see that change is if we all believe it is possible and are committed to making it. So thank you very much for coming along, for your thoughtful comments, and let's make that change.